Hey, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel. And today we're going to ask the question, did kangaroos ever live in the Middle East? Actually, that's not the question I'm going to ask. It's actually a question that Ken Ham posed this morning on Twitter. And of course, his answer is yes. They had to have lived in the Middle East because they were on Noah's Ark and they departed from Noah's Ark from the Middle East and made their way to Australia. And of course, we could go into the whole, how did that happen? How did they get there? And we could critique that. That's not actually what I'm going to do today. We're going to look at his tweet, but we're going to approach it from a kind of a different point of view. And I'm going to challenge Ken Ham to prove that kangaroos once lived in the Middle East. I'm going to say, was he there? How could he really know that? Let's see what the heck Joel Duff's talking about today. We'll do that coming up. Okay, here we go. Ken Ham's tweet here. A screenshot of Ken Ham's tweet is on the right side, and then I've copied all the text and put it in Microsoft Word so I can show you over here on the left side. Ken Ham says that when he goes to creation conferences or talks at churches, he often presents this sort of question to sort of stimulate his audience to think about how, in his mind, the secular worldview is creeping in and not allowing them to have the proper view or understanding of history. And so he does that by asking this question. It's really a good rhetorical device that he's using here. He's saying, did kangaroos once live in the Middle East? And as you might imagine, many people know that kangaroos are only found in Australia. If they know a little bit more, they would know that fossils of kangaroos are only found in Australia. And so it's very tempting to think that, kangaroos have always lived just in Australia. And so that's what he says that's the way most people respond. Most people put their hand up like, A is the right answer. They've always lived in Australia. Some might say we don't really know where they've always lived. And few say yes, that they've lived in the Middle East. And then, of course, for Ken Ham, that's completely, that can't be true. It's got to be C. They have to have lived in the Middle East in the past because in his mind, he knows for certain that Noah's Ark preserved the kangaroos, right, through a global flood, and that ark landed in the mountains of Ararat, and those are in the Middle East, and therefore kangaroos once lived in the Middle East before they migrated to Australia. Now, I said in my intro, I'm not going to get into the whole migration thing and the probabilities of that and how hard that would be and how ridiculous it is that all the different kinds of marsupials all move to Australia and all that, right? Let's not deal with that. I'm going a whole different direction with this. And the direction is this. I'm going to challenge Ken Ham's basic premise about the location of the ark. All right? How confident. In other words, he has incredible confidence that kangaroos lived once in the Middle East. He thinks that confidence is grounded upon absolute biblical truth, and therefore there can be no denying it. But let me suggest he should not be that confident. Actually, his answer should have been B, that we don't know where, or he should say answer is B, because he doesn't know where they've always lived or have lived in the past. So let me try to demonstrate that by coming down here. He's going to point out his logic is that he asked, the way he gets people to come around to his viewpoint is to say look, don't you believe in Noah's Ark? Well, yes, his audience does. Don't you believe that two animals were on the ark of all the different kinds? Well, yes. Don't you believe that kangaroos are a kind of organism God created? Well, yes. And don't you believe that the ark landed on the mountains of Ararat in the Middle East? And of course, the audience says yes. And then his inescapable conclusion from that is, then of course, if that's all true and you just agreed all those things are true, then kangaroos did live in the Middle East. And when he asked the question again, of course, everyone, oh yeah, you're right. You got me there. They actually lived in the Middle East. All right, so what crazy thing is Dr. Duff going to say about this? I'm going to question the premise, as I said before, of the ark landing on the mountains of Ararat in the Middle East. So I'm not gonna argue that the ark didn't land in the mountains of Ararat because there is a literal Bible verse that says that. All right, so I'm going to go with Ken Ham's literalism here, and I'm going to say that absolutely land on the mountains of Ararat, but the Bible doesn't say on the mountains of Ararat at this specific location that you all know exactly where that location is, and it's in the Middle East. Let's start here. For the Christian, the present is not the key to understanding the past. That's the big thing for Ken Ham. You can't just take present things and extrapolate into the past. if you already know what the past history is, right? You have to take the past history for what the past is, and we know the past because revelation is the key to the past, and understanding the past is the key to the present. He flips it around. We already know what the past is, and so all we have to do is figure out how we got to the present situation. This is true for like the origin of different kinds of organisms, different species within kinds. We know that God created kinds once he decides what a kind is, like a canine family. But you can see there's like 40 different species of canines present today. So therefore, the past, knowing the past through revelation, is the key to understanding the present. So therefore, all we have to do is figure out how they got from that past canine type, the two canines on the ark, to the present. They must have changed and speciated to that point, rather than looking at the present things and trying to extrapolate back to find a common ancestor. So let me explain this regard to the kangaroo question. We look at Australia today and see the kangaroo kind with different species. Yes, there are different species of kangaroos, and he's saying they're all one kind of thing, and they share a common ancestor as a result. But what is the history that led them to living there? How did they come to be in Australia? Starting with Genesis 6, we read the account of God calling Noah to build the ark because he was going to judge the wickedness of man with a global flood. So he brought 2 of each animal. So therefore, those 2 would have been 2 of the original kind of kangaroo. 2 of every sort you'll bring. That would have included 2 kangaroo kinds. We know the ark landed in the area today we call the Middle East. Do we? Do we really know that the ark landed in the Middle East? Or do we only know it landed in an area of the mountains of Ararat? How sure is Ken Ham that the mountains of Ararat are the same mountains of Ararat that people today refer to, or even thousands of years ago referred to as the area of the mountains of Ararat? How does he know for certain those are the exact mountains? Was he there? Did he see the ark on those mountains? Did he see the ark on those mountains? Was he there? Does he have pictures of the ark up there on those mountains? Does he have any physical evidence of the ark actually in those mountains? No. No to all those things. What does he have? He has revelation that he is interpreting as the words on the page saying the mountains of Ararat as being those mountains over there that some people have called the mountains of Ararat. And he's inferring that those mountains are exactly the same mountains as referred in the scriptures. All right. I don't think that's an unreasonable thing to think, but however, it is, it's part of our reasoning. It's our inference. It's not absolute truth. All right. So what if I were to say that Noah's Ark landed on the mountains of Ararat, but Noah's Ark landed in the mountains of Ararat, and the mountains of Ararat are actually a reference to a particular place in India. All right? Maybe it's somewhere in the Himalayas. And there's an area there that's being referred to as the mountains of Ararat. And people got off. All right? The ark lands there. The animals get off the ark. The kangaroos then move from India, and then they have to migrate to Australia. Still lots of problems with that, but let's give them that. If they could migrate from the Middle East, they could also migrate from India, and they migrate. They hooftail it. They hop to Australia, and the people get off the ark. Noah and his family, and they leave the ark. Maybe they grow the vineyard, and then from there they migrate to the Middle East. All right, and then by the time they get to the Middle East, then they gather in one place called the Tower of Babel. All right, does Ken Ham know that I'm wrong? If I suggest that as a possible scenario, can he prove that I'm wrong? All right, because if he can't prove that I'm wrong, then there may never have been kangaroos in the Middle East. All right, the best you could say is they were in India. I'll go one step further. I'll say maybe Noah's Ark landed in Australia. Kangaroos got off and stayed there, but everybody else left Australia and moved to another location. Now, none of these scenarios are any less likely than any other scenario in terms of in terms of migration patterns around the world, because young Earth creationists have all kinds of issues with how did the animals get to where they're at? Why are sloths only in South America and blah, blah, blah. Each one of them requires some kind of incredible long distance travel And a whole bunch of other things have to happen. They had to get on rafts, or they had to be, the oceans had to be lower because of ice ages, and they had to go all the way up north and then come back down south, right? There's all kinds of problems. So wherever you put the ark, you're going to have similar problems. So you can solve one problem by putting the ark in Australia, and then it's like, nope, all the kangaroos, actually marsupials in general, they're all there in Australia, and it's easy to explain them. It becomes very difficult to explain other things in Africa, but you just explained Australia really well. Or I could place the ark in North America, and then I could explain all of North American and South American organisms, and then everything else migrated from there. And humans migrated to South America. South America, the Middle East. All right, and you say, okay, that's absurd. What are you talking about? I mean, the Bible says they land on the mountains of Ararat, and there's these mountains, which are the mountains of Ararat. There's a couple problems with the mountains of Ararat with this, right? And those are this. We don't need this anymore. Here's a couple problems. One is, you're assuming that the mountains of Ararat referenced in the Bible are the same mountains that locals hundreds of years or even 1,000 years later call that particular region. Now, let me give you an example of why that doesn't necessarily have to be true. I'm going to suggest there doesn't have to be a one-to-one connection between the mountains of Ararat in the Turkey-Syria border and the mountains of Ararat that are mentioned in the scriptures. They don't have to be the same place. Now, it's helpful, and it's most likely it is the same place. But Ken Ham can't be 100% confident that they are, even though I think he is. And why do I say that? A couple different reasons. One would be an actual biblical argument. The second one is more of a geological argument. All right, so the first one is this. Is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that are mentioned throughout scriptures, are they always the same river? All right, now think about this. Does the Tigris and Euphrates River get mentioned before the flood? Yes, they do. All right. Is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers mentioned after the flood? Absolutely, they are. What does Ken Ham believe that the flood did? He believes that it completely wiped off the face of the earth and completely remodeled the surface of the earth. The Middle East didn't even exist as the Middle East before the flood. And so where those rivers are on top of thousands of feet of sediment that were laid down by the flood. So there was no Tigris and Euphrates River as we know the Tigris and Euphrates River today before the flood. And yet there was a thing that was called the Tigris and Euphrates River. So one of the explanations, and I think Ken Ham would probably go with this explanation, and say like after Noah got off of the ark and then was wandering around, he and his family was wandering around, eventually they came to call certain rivers that they came across the Tigris and Euphrates River because they had a historical memory of before the flood of two rivers called the Tigris and Euphrates River. And basically it's like a memorial to them, right? It's like kind of like we have lots of cities named in North America, names that are the same as European names. So if that city in Europe was the first city to be called that particular name, and then you name another city after it, they're not the same thing. They're not the same city, right? It's sort of like you're saying like, I'm honoring, the individuals of where I came from, and I'm going to create a new city called this. So you have rivers after the flood being named rivers that had been there before the flood, but they are not the same river, right? They evolved, right? They developed completely differently, and they're in a different location, right? They go from one place to another in a different way because those mountains didn't exist before the flood that they're coming down from. And so you can have the mountains of Ararat. The mountains of Ararat could be mountains that are mentioned, all right? But Noah landed on the mountains of Ararat. Then they move to the Middle East. And what do? They see the series of mountains that kind of reminds them of the Himalayas. And they say, I'm going to call these the mountains of Ararat. Right? And that's what they come to be known as by everybody around. Right? And even different cultures. They begin to understand as they populate that Middle Eastern world. They call it the mountains of Ararat. Are they the mountains where Noah's landed? Nope. They're just mountains that are called the same thing that Noah had called it, that the scriptures or Noah had written down as being the mountains of Ararat originally. Now, You could make a reasonable, I think Ken Ham could come with a reasonable argument and say like, well, now, Noah actually wrote these things down, and he wouldn't have written down the mountains of Ararat because that was confusing to people at the time. If he was really talking about the Himalayas, well, maybe, but maybe he's just reporting exactly what he called those mountains that he landed on originally, the Himalayas, and then others have confused things later on by changing, adding, putting that name on other places. All right, the geological argument. There's a geological problem for Ken Ham. Mount Ararat itself is a very large shield volcano, and it's not considered to be very old, right? Like 1.5 million years old. That's extremely young. It's young lava, and it's all volcanic in nature. So it wasn't covered by the flood, all right? Otherwise, it'd have all kinds of sediments on it, right? And so it is a post-flood place. I don't think that Noah, even though people have looked for Noah's Ark on the sides of Mount Ararat, it doesn't really make sense to look for it there, because if it's a post-flood mountain, it would have formed after the flood. Or even if you want to say that it formed at the very last stages of the flood, after the flood kind of was starting to subside and then grew up, and then Noah's landed on it, he would have landed on a big piece of basically hot lava. It's not a very good place to land. And the other mountains of Ararat around Mount Ararat itself, right, though that chain of mountains are all fairly young, and they're volcanic in nature, right? They all ooze up through cracks that are in the sedimentary layers that are below. So for Answers in Genesis, they have all those layers of sedimentary rock are from the flood. And then post-flood, you had magma move up through those flood layers, right? Those flood deposits, and then deposit these mountains on top, right? Most creationists believe that the mountain chains that we see today are developments of a post-flood world. And so all mountains are only 4,350 years old or so. They might have formed very quickly, but still they're post-flood events for the most part. And so it doesn't really make sense that the mountains of Ararat would be a location where the Ark landed, on those particular mountains that we actually call the mountains of Ararat today. And so we don't know. Ken Ham, I gotta go back and say, Ken Ham wasn't there, right? He didn't actually see the Ark. He's not that old, right? He wasn't there to see the Arks land in the Middle East. He doesn't know if people may have migrated to the Middle East from wherever the Ark was, right? He's very willing to say that animals could have gotten off the Middle East and moved to all kinds of extreme parts of the world. And he even thinks that human beings, of course, have made all the way to North America within just a few hundred years. And so tremendous migration is possible in the young earth creationist worldview. And so tremendous migration of human beings is also possible, which means the Ark location is really unknowable. We know what the name of that location is because it's recorded for us. If we say that, since the scriptures are inspired, the author, whether that's Moses or Noah transcribing or writing something down and eventually having Noah compile it, having Moses compile it, all of that leads to the preservation of the name of the location. But the name of the location, we don't necessarily know exactly where that location is. All right, so that's all I got to say. This is all just about saying, look, Ken Ham, you don't know where the Ark actually landed. You cannot know for certain. You can't know for certain the same way you know other things from Scripture. So you like to think that everything comes back to, we have revelation, we know these things. I'm just saying, be careful what you think you know. You do not know that the mountains of Ararat that are on the Syria border are the same mountains of Ararat that are mentioned by the biblical author as the landing place of Noah's Ark. They may refer to another place that has just been lost in time, lost to our understanding. And so it's a little presumptuous for you to be absolutely certain that you know that Noah's Ark landed in the Middle East. All right, that's it. That's all I got. We'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.